Welcome to Bach 101, an introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, a presentation of Music Worcester. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Shepard, the artistic director of The Complete Bach. Now, let's talk Bach. For you committed followers of Bach 101, you may remember that I began this entire podcast series with a joke about Bach being God. Now, I do think that that is probably true. Bach was one of the greatest Western musicians who ever lived, and in particular, he was one of the greatest musical intellects and architects who ever lived. But the problem with thinking of Bach as a god, which so many people have done since his death 275 years ago, is that it makes him seem unreachable. It can feel like only a high priest of music could truly understand what he was trying to do. Now, I'll freely admit that Bach's musical mind was so extraordinary and multifaceted that there will always be aspects of his work that only those with significant training can fully grasp. Personally, I've never been all that drawn to music theory or mathematics, so I know that there are many depths of Bach's genius that I myself will never quite understand. But I would argue that understanding is not the point. For Bach, although he loved exploring techniques and the puzzle-making aspect of composition, his ultimate goal was twofold: to exalt God and to move his fellow people. This is such a fundamental aspect of Baroque music, encapsulated in what is known as the doctrine of affects, or the doctrine of the affections. Music didn't merely represent an emotion, it was meant to elicit that emotion in the listener. And I believe Bach achieved this more effectively than any other Baroque composer. Now, why am I saying all this for this particular set of episodes? Because we're now turning to the form of music for which Bach is justly best known, the fugue. Bach is considered the master, even the perfecter of this form, truly the god of the fugue. Many composers before him, especially in Italy and Germany, were prolific and proficient fugue writers. But as with so many things we've seen with Johann Sebastian Bach, he took an already mature form and expanded it, exploring its possibilities in ways that no one else had imagined. Now, because of the mythology and hagiography surrounding Bach as a musical god, the fugue has gained a reputation as something only understandable by those high priests of music. But I'm here to tell you that is simply not true. Like many art forms, the fugue is actually quite understandable on a fundamental level. As you peel away its layers, yes, it becomes more complex, but even the outer layers are accessible. By the end of these episodes, I believe you'll understand the first couple of layers as well as anyone who loves listening to fugues. The next layers, those requiring more understanding of music theory, will appeal to those with additional training. And finally, there are those layers that even I haven't fully explored, deep mysteries that fascinate music theorists and mathematicians alike. But let me assure you, you don't need to understand those layers to get a fugue, and certainly don't need to understand them in order to be moved by one, which was Bach's goal. Fugues are for everyone, and my goal here is to show you why. Keep this in mind. A lover of architecture doesn't need to be able to do advanced calculus to be deeply moved looking at a Frank Lloyd Wright house or a great Gothic cathedral. The architect had to understand math, yes, and Bach was the greatest fugal architect of all and understood music theory like a master mathematician. But we don't have to know what he knew, we just have to feel what he built. When classical music lovers hear the word fugue, they probably think of an example like the one I'm going to play for you in a second. This is from The Art of the Fugue, a monumental work that Bach wrote in the final decade of his life. This is classic encyclopedic Bach, a work where he explores all the theoretical aspects of fugal writing, in 14 fugues and 4 canons. The fugue subject, a word that we're going to return to in a moment, is in a minor key. It's sober and somber, very German, keeping the listener at something of a distance. There's nothing wrong with this, but I think it reinforces many people's idea of a fugue as more mathematical than musical. It's certainly not immediately emotionally gripping. Listen to this opening of The Art of the Fugue. All well and good, but like I say, a little on the sober side. But when I think of fugues, that's not the piece that comes to mind. The opening theme of this podcast series is the glorious beginning of the Gloria from the Mass in B minor. A few minutes into that movement, Bach launches into what I believe may be the most beautiful and moving fugue ever written. For me, this is the essence of a Bach fugue. It can simultaneously express several musical, theological, and emotional ideas, lifting and exhilarating our souls. I defy anyone to hear this music and say that it is simply mathematical or architectural. Let's listen to this brief clip from that fugue, and I'll come back to explain in a bit what you've just heard. After that, we'll dive into the first full fugue of this episode, which I will use to teach you all the important aspects of fugal writing. Today is a listening day, a reminder that fugues are for experiencing, for feeling, for being moved by, not just for analysis in music theory class. This clip, the Et in terra pax from the Mass in B minor, is actually from a recording that I made in Sydney, Australia, with my Sydneyan Bach choir, from the very first concert of the extended project like The Complete Bach, when we did the complete choral cantatas. I use this recording because, quite frankly, YouTube will pull us down if I use a commercial recording without permission. So it's a live recording. It has its imperfections in terms of the sound quality, but I do love that idea that it ties in so beautifully with our own series, The Complete Bach. So let's listen to this beautiful fugue, and then let me say a couple things about it afterwards. So one of the questions with a fugue, or any form of music, is why would Bach choose that form to express his ideas? He used fugues in order to contain contrasting ideas that work together in a new kind of fabric. I always think of music like this as a tapestry in which the different threads combine to create something new. It's a little bit like the way that people say that Mozart invented the psychological operatic ensemble. There were, before Mozart operas, clearly times when all the different characters would sing together. But Mozart's genius in that form was to be able to express the psychological intent behind each character as they sang together. I think a fugue is a little bit like that. It can contain all those different ideas. for example, in that clip that you just heard, what are the different ideas? Well, the text is, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men. That is a prayer, and you hear that pleading slur, di, da, that sense of pleading. So that's the first aspect, and it finishes with a little escape there. Et in terra pax hominum bone voluntas. And even that idea, people of goodwill, has a bit of joy in that. And then we have this upward figure for, again, people of goodwill. Isn't that wonderful? So the beginning, which had that pleading, instead we have this spreading of the goodwill. And you and I have been talking a great deal about theology in the music of Bach. When he uses 16th notes, it often means the Holy Spirit. So this is the Holy Spirit at work, spreading that goodwill. And then there's a lovely little figure at the very end, pax, pax, peace, peace. And when you put all of those together at once, it creates a new structure. It is that tapestry idea. And that is what helps to create everything that is in a fugue. Here's the question. I've been using this word fugue. What is a fugue? Well, let's delay that definition even a tiny bit longer. And instead, let's talk about texture. I mentioned that idea of a tapestry. Texture refers to how different lines interact with one another. So there are three words that we want to talk about today, and they all end with the word for sound in Greek, and that is phone, like telephone, sound that's going across. Phonic is the adjective form, so everything ends, these three words, with phonic. And it is really quite simple, the concept. These are the three words. Monophonic, which means one sound. Homophonic, which means same sound. And polyphonic, which means many sounds. I'm going to give you an example where we're going to build up to something that Bach wrote in the B minor Mass as well. But let's do it from the very beginning of history, because this little section that I'm going to demonstrate for you began its life as Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant, which is one line with no harmony, no interaction with other lines, is a perfect example of monophonic writing, one sound. This is from the Mass, the Confiteor. So this is the original line. A monk might sing, Confiteor unum baptisma in remissionem peccatorum, which just means that we believe in one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. Now you could take a line like that, and you could add harmony to it. So I'm just going to add some pretty unremarkable harmony to that, so you can see what homophonic means. Homo meaning same, so it's the same sounds going in the same directions, making chords that are blocks of sound. So let me give you an idea about that. And when we hear chorales, which we have talked about, hymns are a perfect example of homophonic writing. Monophonic, Gregorian chant. Homophonic, chorales, hymns. Polyphonic, many lines working together. This is how we find our way to the fugue. But you know polyphonic music from your earliest childhood, because a round, row, row, row your boat, That is the best example of polyphonic music. You can take a melody, and then if somebody starts it later, you have polyphonic writing, a great example of what is known as polyphony. Polyphony, noun, polyphonic, adjective. So let me give you an example of that. I'm going to take that same Gregorian chant, confiteor, and I'm going to play it in the left hand, followed by the right hand, and this is what is known as a canon, C-A-N-O-N, and it just means around. It's just like Frère Jacques. So listen to that and see if you can follow them back and forth. And that's it. It's just a canon. They sing the exact same thing, but slightly staggered. Now let's go one step further. We are inching our way towards the fugue. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a canon exactly like that, but we're going to put them in two different keys. They are a fifth apart, so that the bass is going to start on this note, and then the alto here. Now, you don't need to understand the music theory of that. You don't need to worry about what pitches they are. But the point is this, that as they became more advanced through the Middle Ages, they played around. They said, what about if we do a canon that isn't with the same pitches, but is further apart in two different keys? And that allowed many developments a couple centuries later to the fugue. So this is actually what Bach wrote in the B minor Mass. And there's actually other music swirling in and around that, but that's the basic idea. As a form becomes more complex, it blossoms into whole new forms. So as the canon became more complex, the form couldn't contain itself. So they invented a new form. I'm going to give you a word that does not matter, but some of you just want to know little details, which I love. The way station on the way from canon to fugue was something called the ricercar, R-I-C-E-R-C-A-R. And as it sounds, that was Italian, the ricercar, and then that morphed into the fugue about a century before Bach's birth. Now, we're not going to spend time looking at fugues right before Bach. I'll throw out some names. In Italy, Frescobaldi. In Northern Europe, we had Sweelinck. And then that guy that I keep talking about because he was so important to Bach's development, Dietrich Buxtehude. They were all great fugue composers. But as I say, Bach eclipsed everybody. Okay, enough of that. Enough of understanding the background in these composers. Like I said, we want to listen to these things. Fugues are like the magic eye pictures of the 1990s. Do you remember those books? It was a wallpaper-like pattern when you first look at it, but it formed an optical illusion that if you look at it long enough, it reveals a hidden image. You sort of stare at it for a while. Listening to a fugue is like that. At first, all you hear is the overall picture, but you can train your ears to follow individual parts of the fugue so that it emerges from the dense texture, just as your eyes did with the magic eye. So once you get used to listening to a fugue, it stops just sounding like a whole bunch of lines blocked together, and you begin to hear the different strands in that polyphonic composition. So we're meandering our way to a definition. And in a way, I may never give a working definition of fugue because that doesn't really matter. It's how you experience it that matters. So one thing we know about it now is that it is polyphonic. Another thing that we know about it is that there are aspects of canon. We use the word canonic, C-A-N-O-N-I-C, canonic writing, to describe when one part repeats something more or less the same as the first part. And that's hugely important in the fugue. What I want you to listen to now is the fugue that we are going to be using today as our example. This is called Sicut locutus est, and it's from Bach's Magnificat. And I'm purposely using a sung fugue because by having the words there, it gives your ears something more to hang on to. Plus, you get the benefit of hearing a bass voice versus an alto voice and how different that timbre is. We're going to pick this apart and listen to it several times in several different ways. And I am extremely grateful to 4 of my colleagues from CONCORA, Connecticut Choral Artists, a professional choir in Hartford that will sing every year as part of the Complete Bach, because I asked them each to record their lines separately. They did not do this in the same room, so that I could play with the mix to bring different things out. And a particular shout out to Alex O'Neill. I said that it's 4 singers, but it's a 5-part fugue. Alex is both a tenor and a countertenor, so he is doing double duty here. Let's listen, first of all, to the fugue without me doing anything to bring anything out. This is the first section of Sicut locutus est from Bach's Magnificat.
Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros, Abraham et Semi eius in saecula. Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros, Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros,
Let's now talk about the various components of a fugue. The most important component is called the subject, which is presented all by itself at the very beginning, just as one voice in a canon like Frère Jacques would start alone. There's always a solo. I mean, it might be a full section of instruments or choir, but it is a line that is on its own. And in fact, because of that, you would not know at the beginning of fugue whether it is monophonic, one line, one sound, one voice, or polyphonic. You don't know that until the second voice comes in. Here's the opening statement of the subject of that Sicut locutus est, as you just heard it. Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros. So that is the subject. And as you listen to a fugue, the best thing to do at first is simply to follow the fugue subject as it enters in each voice. Basically, it goes from one fugue subject to another. Let me show you on piano, and then you can go back and listen to the exact same recording, and you now are more directed. So the bass starts, and he's answered by the tenor. Sicut locutus est ad Patris no. And as you can tell, it's the exact same material, but remember when I showed you how you could do a canon in 2 different keys? In a fugue, that happens all the time. So they answer one another. So let's go back now and listen to that first section. But this time, I'm going to raise the volume of the subject only every time it enters. So you can follow it all the way through. There are 4 measures where there's no fugue subject, but we won't worry about that. And it goes from the bass to the tenor to the alto to the lower soprano to the higher soprano. Let's have a listen to that.
Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros. Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros. Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros. Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros.
Now, your ears have been partly trained, so let's go back and listen to that same section again, but this time it'll be like the first time you heard it. I'm not going to play with the volume at all. See if your ears can separate out that fugue subject yourself without me raising them. Bass, tenor, alto, soprano 2, soprano 1. And it is a little bit like with your eyes only seeing one part of a painting. You can train your ears to only hear one part of the music. So let's listen to that opening section again.
Sicut locutus locutus est ad Padres nostros, Abraham et sevi eius in saecula, sicut locutus est ad Padres in saecula, sicut locutus est ad Padres in saecula,
Do you remember how I said that a fugue allows a composer to express many different ideas at the same time? We have the subject, which is the first idea. The first different idea is called the counter subject, which is really convenient because it says everything you need to know. It works against the subject, but always in reference to the subject. They are fraternal twins, but they interlock with one another. We sometimes also refer to it as an answer because it answers that subject, but I really do like to use the word counter subject because it really does keep in mind this idea that the counter subject is indivisible from the subject itself. Let's think for a moment about this idea of different characteristics of these different ideas that the composer might want to express. For example, the text here means, as was spoken to our forefathers, Sicut locutus locutus est ad Patris nostros, to our forefathers. And you hear that has almost a pomposity to it. It's slightly regal and it's certainly grounded, isn't it? So it reflects that idea of something that was given from God to his people. But what about the counter subject? The counter subject sounds like this. So already, remember counter, it has to have a different character. It is more in motion. So that when I play them together and you think about how they're related, listen to this. So the subject is still there in what will eventually be the tenor, but this counter subject, the text is Abraham and his seed, his descendants, forever. Abraham et semini eius in saecula. Abraham et semini eius in saecula. And so what is Bach doing there? The idea of the seed germinating from generation to generation is moving in a scale. Semini eius in saecula. So we get the stentorian voice of God in the subject. It's very stately, and then more motion in the second counter subject. So it's always about contrast. It's always about how they work together. So let's now do the same thing with the counter subject that we did with the subject. Here's a version of the same excerpt. This time, the counter subject, Abraham et semini eius, that is going to be raised a little bit. Let me warn you, if you have not done a lot of listening like this with fugues, your ear will migrate a little bit towards the subject because you know it so well already. But that's great. Eventually, you will want to be able to hear both of those components at the same time. But I will help you by turning that volume up. So now let's listen to that section again with the countersubject volume raised.
Sicut locutus locutus est ad Patris nostros, Abraham et semini eius in saecula. Abraham et semini eius in saeculas. Abraham et semini eius in saeculas. Sicut locutus est Abraham et semini eius in saeculas.
Now, just like before, let's listen to the same section without me raising the volume at all. Try to follow only that counter subject with the word Abraham in it. Again, your ear may migrate towards the subject, but try to override it. Try to focus on the counter subject.
Sicut locutus locutus est ad Patris nostros, Abraham et semini eius in saecula. Sicut locutus est ad Patris in saecula. Sicut locutus est ad Patris in saecula.
After all that listening, you already know the two most important parts of the fugue, the subject and the counter subject. And honestly, it's enough to know about just the counter subject and the subject in order to be able to follow a fugue from beginning to end and keep your interest the whole time. And that is what I want for you, that every time you hear a fugue during the complete Bach, I want your ears engaged. Bach will engage your heart and your soul, I promise. He does the most amazing things with his fugues. But you can also engage your brain by following those different strands, by finding that magic eye and letting it be revealed to you. There is also another class of material, not subject, not counter subject, that is also important. We refer to this material as episode. So if it's not subject or counter subject, it is called episode, or we sometimes say episodic material. In a general sense, remember what this tapestry is about. Different lines, different threads, thinking about like a Mozart opera ensemble. It's all about providing contrast, different characters against the subject. If the subject was always present, as it is in a canon, like Frère Jacques or Row, Row, Row Your Boat, then it's harder to bring the subject out in a really exciting way. We love canons, and they can be really quite complicated, but they are still limited by the fact that that original line is omnipresent. But if you go for 12 or 16 measures without the subject being present, think about it. When it enters again later, it's even more exciting because the composer has built tension and a sense of expectation for the re-entry of the subject. Let me say that in a different way. By presenting that subject so clearly on its own and then adding part by part, your ear grows accustomed to it and your ear grows to expect to hear it. So when it's taken away, your ear subconsciously still has that expectation. And the longer a composer can draw out the episode section, that episodic material, subconsciously, the more you are craving that sense of return home that the re-entry of the subject will bring. Now, I'm not going to use this fugue to show you how Bach comes up with his ideas for episodic material, because they are always related to the subject itself. Remember what I say about Bach. He is very economical. So he takes a tiny idea at the beginning of any composition and spins out the whole composition. We will do that with the next fugue because it has a great example of that in terms of episode being related to the subject. But for now, let me just show you what the episode material is in this fugue. Because the cool thing about this fugue is that the episode also has theological meaning because of its text. So remember what the text was. As was spoken to our forefathers, subject, Abraham and his seed, his progeny forever. And then this is what happens with the episode material, the material that is neither subject nor counter-subject. In secula, and that means forever. In secula. And what I love about the setting of that word, that expression in this fugue, is he uses long notes to represent the length of forever. We've been moving along. Abraham et seminieius in secula sicut locutus est in secula. And all of a sudden, it elongates. And then you may have heard that I sang sicut locutus est, which is not like, it is not the subject, but it's a little bit like it. That's how episode material works. For example, he goes on with more episode. Sicut locutus est ad patris nostros, sicut locutus est, and the same thing, in secula. The episode does not matter, in a sense, what it is. It matters that it is. It matters just that it's there, because it's there to be a contrast. It's there to provide more material, because the texture, that tapestry that we're weaving, would be too thin if it was just subject and counter-subject all the time. So one last time, let's use volume to train your ear. This time, I'm going to turn the volume up on the episode material. It's a little trickier because when different lines have episode, they overlap and interact. So you won't just be following one line like we did with the subject and the counter-subject. But I think you'll get the idea of how the episode provides a contrast to the subject and counter-subject. And like I say, it's not what it is that matters, it's that it is. It's there to provide the background cohesion of all of the music. So let's listen to that same section again, not with subject or counter-subject raised, though your ear is now going to still hear them, but with the episode volume raised.
Sicut locutus est ad patris nostros, Abraham et seminieius in secula. Sicut locutus est in secula. Sicut locutus est ad patris nostros, sicut locutus est ad patris nostros, sicut locutus est in secula.
As we start to formulate together the architecture of a fugue, we are listening to it before we describe it. But what you will see eventually is that there will often be a long section near the end of the whole fugue that serves to prepare the listener for the final appearance of the fugue subject. I hate to say every when I talk about the music of Bach, because Bach does love his exceptions, but I would be comfortable putting a fair amount of money on the idea that every fugue finishes with a final entry of the fugue subject right near the end. Because as I say, he has built this whole superstructure, this whole building, this whole example of architecture around your expectation to hear the fugue subject. So almost every fugue will end with a final example of that fugue subject. In this fugue, the Sicut locutus est, Bach uses the counter subject. Remember Abraham? He uses that counter subject to generate this final section. The way that he plays with it is that he puts that on the top in the first soprano with chords underneath this time. Not polyphony, many sounds, but homophony, same sounds. So you can hear that Abraham counter subject at the top, but Bach uses this section to get our ears ready for a final entry of the fugue subject in the bass. It's the same voice that started the fugue, and because it's the bass, we can think of it as the final example of the voice of God, vox Dei, that low voice intoning this promise that he has spoken to our forefathers. So let's hear that last section, and I'm going to raise the volume for that final bass fugue subject entry.
Abraham, Abraham, et semideus, Abraham, et semideus, secula, sicut locutus est a Patris nostros. Abraham, et semideus, et secula.
Okay, your ears are trained now. So let's hear the entire movement all together. The first section, and then this new section that you heard, and I'm not going to do anything with the volume. Again, try to follow principally the subject, and then, as you get good at it, the counter subject, if you're able to. Feel free to rewind and do it a few times, and see, you can almost feel your brain sort of clunk, clunk, shift into position as your ear is able to follow different things. And I will make this promise to you. After 11 years, you will get really good at being able to follow individual lines in fugues. That is your money-back guarantee. Let's listen to the whole fugue, Sicut locutus est, from Bach's Magnificat.
Sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros, Abraham et semideus in secula, sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros, sicut locutus est ad Patris nostros,
It's not the end of our discussion of fugue. I'll do another episode after this, and sorry, now I've got the word episode, which means two different things. I mean podcast episode, not fugal episode, where we're going to look at a keyboard fugue, and then some more fugue after that. But this is your introductory episode. But I do have one last thing to say here. This is something that they refer to in Hollywood as a slow reveal. You know that we always like our 3 E words: encyclopedic, economical, and enigmatic. For Encyclopedic, I mentioned that art of the fugue. When I played that fugue, I mentioned that work that is called The Art of the Fugue and how Bach wrote every possible kind of fugue that there was in that work, even though we're not going to go into that kind of detail here. The second E, economical, you can see straight away that a fugue is an extraordinarily economical form because it uses the same material throughout the piece. We will talk in even greater detail about how economical fugue writing can be in the next fugue that we will discuss. But we should never forget that third E, enigmatic. This is the idea behind the music that we hear, that Bach often plants a code that reveals a hidden meaning, often theological, because he was a church musician. I love the code in this fugue. As I said, the text refers to the promise that God made to Abraham and our foreparents, his descendants. This is an Old Testament promise. This is something that God said to Abraham in the Old Testament. And we have already talked about how the solidity, the stolidity of that subject, pom, 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 pa, 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 almost pomposity, how that reflects that idea of God making his promise. But here is the enigma, the encoded message. It turns out that this fugue is a very specific kind of fugue, and it's fairly rare. It is called a permutation fugue, and its rules are even more strict than usual. It occupies that netherworld between a canon and a fugue. I don't mention this because you need to know that fact, but I mention it because of the code. The permutation fugue has more rules. It is a very rule-bound form. And when Bach refers to the Old Testament law, and Abraham is embodied just like Moses in the law that God gives the Israelis, the Jewish people, when he refers to the Old Testament law, he sometimes uses a permutation fugue because it is about rules. The rules of the fugue equal the rules of the law that God gave the Israelis. Isn't that wonderful? Even within the complexity of a fugue, Bach can implant ideas that still need to be decoded. Well, you are on your way to being an expert on the fugue, and it's all about listening. It's all about listening. So in the next episode, we'll do more listening and just keep training your ears. So as always, come back for the next episode where together we can talk Bach. Thank you so much.